Sundays, and we are talking about World War One. This week we are going to have a special. We're going to talk about the air battles in a nutshell. So everything from the Red Baron on to the Americans who volunteered before the United States entered the war. It's all fair game. Well, let's start at the origin. So the Wright brothers, right? That's the origin.
Well, in a certain sense, yeah, but it is the Wright brothers. I mean, they're the ones that created the first flying heavy than aircraft that actually flew. There's a lot of debate about. There are a number of people who've tried to claim no, that's not what happened. It was another group that actually did it. But the reality is that when everybody examines those claims, all right, there's no evidence. And whether you like it or not, the Wright brothers came out with evidence immediately. Basically, they had a picture of it. So,
no, and it's really interesting though too that they made bicycles. Really interesting how the airplane actually came about, isn't it?
Well, not only did okay, but you got to remember the time frame in which that existed. Yeah, but they did make bicycles. They were bicycle mechanics, the Wright brothers, but they were really mechanics. Okay, they were turning their own stuff. In fact, the engine that they used, all right, they designed and they built. Okay.
What was it? The equivalent of a little two-stroke engine for like a dirt bike nowadays?
Yeah, I don't even think it has that kind of power.
Well, it's they were pretty much 1 horsepower. Like you got more powerful fucking little petrol generators now.
Like, I think it had a total of. I think they estimated a total of 15 horsepower out of the engine.
Yeah, and that's both of them.
And so probably, and they were doing all of this on its own, and of course they don't have a lot of money. So what are they making this thing out of? The vast majority of what they were making this out of was basically plywood, and light wood, actually not plywood, but light wood and cloth. It was the lightest thing they could come up with.
Yeah, and there's another interesting little aspect about the Wright Flyer as well, is that it didn't have flaps or slats or fucking movable surfaces and all this kind of stuff. It turned via what's called wing warping. So instead of having ailerons and flaps on the main wings, literally they just bent the wings so it sort of gave like a sort of an up curve or a down curve, and that's how they were changing direction, banking and turning and whatnot. And this technology has had come in recently as the 90s and early 2000s with some of the X-planes that they were looking at trying to do wing warping and wing molding, basically changing the shape of the aircraft, sort of kind of like a swing wing type deal, but having like a solid surface instead of a swinging surface. And the whole idea basically was to try and get more performance out of the single airframe, where you can have, like with the F-14 Tomcat, the whole idea was, you could spread the wings out and you have lots of surface for low level and low speed handling and whatnot. But if you really needed to get it up high and fast and really quick, you just swing the wings back, make it so sleek and aerodynamic, off you go. So there's technology now still being sort of researched and used from all the way back then.
Well, right. But if you take a look at it, this is a picture of the Wright Flyer. And you can see exactly what Fardy's talking about. Specifically, you don't see any flaps, right? You don't see any ailerons, okay? To turn this, they did exactly what he said, is they would basically squish or warp the wing to cause it to turn, because they were trying to mimic what birds do, all right? I mean, birds don't have ailerons, okay? But so they were trying to mimic what birds do. They had realized that the back end here, this part here, all right, wasn't enough to actually turn the airframe, that you actually had to warp the wings in order to turn it and everything. Right? So that was a major part of what they're doing, So it's interesting when you take a look. That's where airplanes began, and this is 1903 that you have the first confirmed flight.
Okay, just real quick, Falcon should be here any second.
Excellent.
Okay, cool. And no, as you go into World War One, they are using. We've talked about this before. They are using the aircraft as reconnaissance. Pretty much just flying over and watching and taking photographs. As they start to expand from that and actually fire on each other, there comes a need for one, a co-pilot, and two, the mechanism that the fucking Germans came up with, right?
Well, initially with aircraft, like when you're starting to look at World War II, they actually had proper engines and flaps and movable surfaces and things like that. Just notable in the earlier aircraft is that they had radial engines. However, they were called rotary engines initially because the entire engine actually spun with the propeller, whereas normally a radial engine, the engine itself sits and there's a gearbox that spins the propeller. And this wasn't realised until this wasn't realised until a little bit into the war, where they'd found that the actual momentum of the actual engine spinning itself would create a torque on the aeroplane and a rotating motion. So that's where they sort of went, hang on, if we made the engine stop and then made only the propeller move, that's a big advantage. They started getting more power out of the aircraft by that stage.
Well, I hate to be the guy that immediately hops in and immediately makes a correction. The rotaries, they actually, by 1915, a few months after they started to have a few airplanes that had them, they already knew the problems. Yeah. But there were already designs out there for the later radials. The only thing is, the radials still had issues with keeping the valves closed, whereas the rotaries, they had a counterweight on the valve so that the faster the engine spun, the harder the valves were stayed closed. Also, actually the biggest issue with the rotary was the gyroscopic force, not twisting the fuselage. It was really, if you try to pull up only a little bit, it immediately wanted to go into a complete nose up attitude. It always wanted to go 90 degrees of whatever position it was in. So you go up a little bit, and then you'd be fighting to not go straight up.
Yeah, and that's due to gyroscopic forces, and you can actually see that when they do the test. Like, there's, I don't know whether you guys have got like a science museum or something like that, but they usually have this sort of like a chair with a wheel on it, and you spin the wheel, and if you turn it from the vertical to the horizontal, it'll start spinning you in a certain direction due to the gyroscopic forces.
Right, and that goes to another point, though, that you guys just both brought up, which is when they were flying these planes, they were doing a lot with muscle power. A lot of what they were doing required a lot of personal strength.
Mm-hmm. All of it was. The majority of the controls on aircraft back then were not balanced. So if you look at a lot of elevators today on smaller airplanes, you'll see either inside there's a counterweight, or you'll see this thing sticking in front of the hinge where part of it, usually on the outboard ends, are sticking in front and going the opposite direction of the elevator, or in some cases the rudder. That's a horn. That's to aerodynamically balance it, so that when you pull back, you don't have to just really hold it back. Like if you're trying to land something like a Piper Cub, you got both hands on that stick and you're just going to keep it in your gut, because that elevator is not balanced. Whereas like a mall, you don't really have to work.
And it's interesting about the little interesting side note too, because I've had this discussion with 9/11 truthers where they say, where the planes crashed, they even detected depleted uranium. Where did that come from? The counterweight's in the tail. Simple.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so with the evolution of aircraft, when they started sticking guns on it, initially you had ideas like they'd put them on top of the higher wing on most biplanes, or on triplanes. In other cases, they'd have a turnable turret sort of system in the observer's seat. And this is before they'd come up with the mechanisms and all this, and you still had to have things like Lewis guns and things like that where they had to reload magazines and whatnot. And it's not until, which we're building up to, the invention of the interrupter gear. Just real quick before we do get onto that, the British couldn't figure out how the Germans were doing it. And they were literally trying everything. Fuck it, we'll just shoot the propeller off. That was one option. We put metal plates on the propellers so the bullets will bounce off. That was another option. And it wasn't until one of the German aircraft had been shot down and was in a condition that they could study it, is when they figured out that, oh, while the engine's turning, there's this little hump on the camshaft. And this little hump kicks a little lever. And that little lever turns off the machine guns as the propeller's going past. Fucking Jesus, isn't that bloody simple?
It was so ingenious. But even after everyone started using interrupter gears, you could only realistically have 2 machine guns on the nose. So a lot of airplanes, they'd still stick 1, sometimes 2, up on the top wing.
The major reason why they also moved the machine guns from the top of the wings to behind the propellers was mainly because it was way easier for the pilot to aim and shoot. He literally just pointed at what he wanted to shoot at and squeezed the trigger. And secondly, it was also because the machine guns at that time weren't as reliable as we'd like to think, and every now and then a belt could bind or jam, or you might have a dud round or something like that, and the option of cocking the machine gun was a valid thing.
Right, well, but there was one more thing that needs to be talked about here, which is they were just trying to just do things, and a lot of this stuff began from a very ad hoc manner. These are things that were being done by people out in the field, not necessarily by the production staff or people that
manufacture.
Right, the manufacturers. It was just people going, "Hey, let me try and put this on there and see what happens."
Well, yeah, exactly that, and you see a lot of that of what both of y'all were talking about, like Farty, an issue that they had all the way into the end of the Second World War with putting machine guns actually in the wings, just like with having nose and top wing mounted guns. You had a certain point in front of you where you wanted the target to be there so that your fire would converge, and then with the North American B-25 Mitchell, medium bomber, the majority of the changes that almost every single change that you see in the aircraft, like at the very end, they had 4 fuselage-mounted forward-facing 20mm cannons. That wasn't something that they did from the factory. All those itty-bitty little incremental changes, people were doing it out in the field, and North Americans said, let's do that. It's working. And it all comes back from the First World War.
And again, one of the things that people talk about, if you take a look at the planes at the beginning of the war, right, just take a look at the difference between the Wright Flyer, which is 1903, and then 1915, you can see the lineage. But by the end of the war, by 1918, you have, for all intents and purposes, proper planes flying, right? The technology across the board in every aspect of the airframe, all right, increased dramatically, all right, due to the war and due to the needs of the war.
Yeah, have a look at bombers, for example, and bombers evolved exactly the same way pretty much as fighters from observer aircraft. And okay, so the bloke in the back seat, well, while I'm flying over the target we're looking at, why doesn't he just drop a few hand grenades out the side? And then the hand grenades basically became actual what looked like, they look like mortar shells pretty much, but fucking, they're starting to actually look like aerodynamic airdrop bombs. And then by the end of the war, you've got things like the Vickers Vimy, where instead of having an observer who literally is eyeballing it, dropping it out the side of the airplane, he's in fact like mounting him on the bottom of the wings, and they're starting to look at sightings and stuff like that. They even tried to prove the point by the end of the war that air power would overmatch battleships and whatnot. They even did a test with it. They had a bomber fly over a battleship and drop some. I can't remember whether they're actual bombs or dummy bombs, but a couple of them hit, and that was proof positive. Yep, definitely, aircraft can destroy ships.
3 quick little fun facts. MC, you brought up the Wright brothers. The density altitude that the Wright brothers are flying in that day was negative 2,000 feet. So they were in the absolute most perfect conditions. So on a normal day, the airplane would not have been able to fly. And it wasn't of course, it was being thrown into the air, or being propelled forward by the counterweight. Well, yeah, with a falling weight. What you were, there's another, Vickers Vimy. That was the first airplane to cross the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
And Billy Mitchell actually did a test, and it took them a few hours. But they sank an old First World War German battleship with aircraft.
There you go.
Right, but in actuality, the Navy didn't really. They weren't impressed with that test because it was under pristine conditions, in their opinion, and of course they're like, well, the ship is not going to sit there and wait to get bombed, and there's not going to be that planes aren't going to be able to take sights on it, etc. And it shows, which is one of the reasons why everyone was still focusing on, even our adversaries that happened in World War II, everyone was still focusing on the power of the battleship rather than the power of the aircraft carrier. It's not that people didn't respect that the aircraft carrier could do something. It's just that even in the Japanese Navy, there was a reason they built the Yamato and the Musashi.
Well, if you have a look at all the battleships that entered World War II, they had absolutely bugger all in the way of anti-aircraft artillery at all. Like they might have had a couple of Oerlikons and maybe a couple of pom-poms and maybe a couple of 5-inch guns, maybe. And that was absolutely woeful for the technology at the time. But yeah, that was the point that they didn't listen to right from World War One.
Exactly. And naval strategy is build strategy, and usually everyone's building for the war that they just fought. The United States, right after Pearl Harbor, all we had was 3 carriers in the Pacific. Our surface plate was decimated. So we had the carriers, and that was really it. We were forced into a situation where we had to rely on them instead of our battleships. And also, even into the First World War, I think this is true, but the Wright Flyer and many other airplanes like it, they were only proof of concepts. And same thing with Billy Mitchell's test. It was this is possible, but it's not ready yet for actual use.
It was more of a, hey, look what's coming.
Exactly.
And just like with most things in humanity and history and all this kind of stuff, the warnings never get heeded. And, oh, shit, when it does happen, oh, geez, how did that happen? We didn't see that coming. No, we've been telling you.
Well, it's very true.
Exactly. Like the first guy whoever brought up, I can't remember his name, he brought up to the Army Air Corps that you could actually take off a twin-engine medium bomber off the deck of a carrier. He was told he was nuts.
Wasn't that Dewey or whatever? He did
Doolittle.
the raid on Japan, right? Doolittle,
yeah. The first person to recommend it. The first person to recommend it was not Doolittle, but it did plant the seed for Doolittle to be able to say, hey, maybe we can do this.
Another thing I find that's quite interesting is we talk about this technology, but the first carrier landing, if you want to talk about it as a carrier, right, was taking place before the war, back in 1911.
Yes.
Right, where you had the USS Pennsylvania. They created a wooden platform for a plane to land on, and it had a tail hook.
No, but MC, a wooden platform.
Well,
the decks
like,
of
how
the
can
Essex
that
class
not go
carriers.
wrong? I mean,
No.
No.
You realize
Wood actually was
light. Yeah, the planes are so light that, like, literally when they landed, they had a dozen guys to catch the aeroplane. That's how light they were.
but wood is inexpensive. It's quick to put on, and it's actually very good at sea because it'll flex and it'll bend a lot easier than steel. Even into the Second World War, all the excess class carriers that we had during that war, they all had wooden decks. The Japanese had wooden decks too.
Yeah, well, it
Wood
took
was
the
normal.
The Enterprise
British
did not have a wooden deck.
Yes, it
in
did.
World War II. It did.
Yes, it did.
Yes, it did.
CV6,
Okay.
USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Lexington all were sister ships. They all were wooden decks.
Okay, I'll stand corrected. All right, fair enough.
But not the. You said one of those. The Lexington. Lexington was a different class.
Oh, sorry.
That's you're thinking the Yorktown, the Hornet, and the Enterprise were the same class ship.
I was wrong.
The Lexington was actually
didn't Yorktown
conversion.
get sank?
Oh yeah, so did the Lexington. so
Yeah.
did the Hornet.
So did Hornet. And Hornet carried Doolittle and his men. Now Hornet got back safe from that raid, but she later sank.
Yeah.
Now, what you did bring up, how you could get, I think you brought up how you could penetrate through a wooden deck or something like that. That ended up being kind of an Achilles heel. The very first ship to be sunk by a kamikaze was the St. Lo, and she was an escort carrier with a wooden deck.
Well, there was definitely disadvantages.
I'm
to
just
the wooden
thinking.
deck.
I'm thinking in modern terms, where like jet fuel and wooden deck. I mean, I don't really see that going well.
Well,
But-
the tactics have
Trust
also
me,
changed drastically. I mean, like if you get anywhere near a US carrier to damage it, you're doing fucking good for a start.
Well, yes, but
Oh, yeah.
the other aspect is the British during World War II had steel decks. They could carry fewer planes, but the aircraft carriers themselves could take a hell of a lot more damage. They were actually far more survivable than the U.S. carriers or the Japanese carriers. It wasn't until the Taiho that the Japanese adopted the steel deck type of technology. By then, the war was, for all intents and purposes, over.
Well, and another thing, you brought up jet fuel. Jet fuel burns more easily than back then 130 octane low lead. A lot of people think 100 octane low lead is high, which it's fairly high, but back then, your normal civilian airplane, 80 octane was considered holy crap. Back in 32 is when the Air Corps started testing with it. By the beginning of the war, all the heavy bombers, like the 17 and the 24, they were running 130 octane.
Okay. Yeah, let's get back now to World War One. Okay, so
Yeah,
I mean
sorry.
we've talked about the technology and some of the things that have been changing, but in the first part of the first year of the war, from 1914 to the mid 1915s, all right, for the most part, both sides were just doing exactly what Farty said. They started off just as reconnaissance. They would wave at one another. You had to worry about the weather. You had to worry about all these other things because the technology hadn't changed. But the first big change that came about happened in 1915. All right, when basically the interrupter gear, which you guys are talking about, came into being, and the result of that was by October of 1915. All right, for about a 3 to 4 month period, for all intents and purposes, the Allied aircraft, the British and the French aircraft, were grounded because of the losses were so severe against the Germans.
Yep, and it also did come down to a hell of a lot with pilot skill, because just by the sheer nature of the aircraft that they were using, there were very, very little vulnerable points to it. Yeah, sure, you could shoot out some control wires, but they're really, really thin, and if you do get it, it's going to be a fluke. So literally, you could hold the plane completely, and it can still sort of be aerodynamic enough for the pilot to sort of get away and escape. The way you could take them out is either by shooting the pilot or disabling the engine, and that you sort of had to be fairly accurate for. And this is where like the interrupter gear and having your machine guns sitting right in front of your nose really did help. So you do hear stories of like they were taking people who were hunters and stuff like that, who knew how to shoot and could shoot straight and things like that. They still hadn't got onto offset shooting or something like that, where you're trying to shoot someone in a turn and you're trying to arc your bullets sort of out in front. But by doing so, especially if you're in a pull-up turn type deal, where the bullets are arcing away underneath you, that kind of a shooting style hadn't really come into form. There is one guy, I can't remember his name, he was an American ace who was like absolutely natural at doing it. He could literally shoot people blind out of the sky in a turn, not a problem.
Eddie Rickenbacker.
Yeah, that probably is who Farty's thinking of. But you are talking about aces, and do you believe that they actually found out who the Red Baron was? Because that is still in contention.
No.
Who the Red Baron was, or
No,
who killed
no,
him?
he was Baron von Richthofen.
Oh, it was who
that's
killed him
possible.
that they
The
were
Baron
wondering,
Yes,
was
right?
Manfred
yes.
von Richthofen.
Now, the
But it is still
controversy with
contested
that,
who kills him.
yeah, the controversy with that was that he was being chased by a couple of RAF planes, and at the same time he came in low, and there was some Australian machine gunners who fired up at him, and it's up in the air who actually hit him properly. But also with the whole aspect of shooting planes down, at the beginning they're only using 303 ball ammunition or 7.92 ball ammunition, depending on which side you're on. The 7.762 ball 769 ammunition's over in Germany, the 303 is British. Now, later in the month, we'll touch on another thing there, which is the airships. And they found that mainly with the airships, that ball ammunition was very ineffective. You're just basically trying to poke little tiny holes in a gigantic thing with a tiny little pin. So this also is where we have the advent of incendiary ammunition and tracer ammunition. And the whole idea with that is so it'll set fire to the material on the other side of whatever you're shooting at.
Well, you can
Exactly,
also see where it's striking.
Exactly. You can see it fly. You can see where it's hitting. It sets fire to whatever it hits. And you made a comment earlier about you can shoot. You can put so many rounds into an airplane and it still keeps flying. That is true. There's only a very, very small area of the airplane is actually vital. You can lose a tremendous amount of stuff and you can still make it.
Well, then that goes back to the changes in the airframes, because initially the changes in the airframes themselves were so flimsy, you could actually do structural damage, and the plane would just instantly come apart. Over time, they became far more robust, where some of these other structural things weren't as important.
Well, the biggest thing was going from a dope and fabric setup where you get a tear and the tear just increases to a aluminum monocop setup. Yeah,
and that's a major advantage. Just one of the things that happens during this. Okay, why don't you talk to us about the strategies of the aerial dogfighting, Falcon?
Okay.
Rule number one.
Right. Rule number one. There's a whole bunch of rules I don't remember. It depends on which.
Never fly straight and level for more than 5 seconds.
Exactly. There's that. There's always put the sun behind you so that your enemy is blinded. Always shoot from the enemy's 6. And whenever you're being attacked, turn into your attacker. Because let's say you're flying straight and level with your buddies in formation, and someone comes down from 3 o'clock high. If you dive for 9 o'clock low, you may be thinking, "Oh, I'm going to run away." No, you just gave them the absolute perfect target. Your 6 o'clock. The only thing you can do really is to point your airplane straight at them, fire some rounds. Even if you don't hit them, you've thrown them off, and now they're on the defensive.
Right, but the problem with that philosophy, of course, is you better hope that if you get into a turning, contest, you can outturn your enemy.
Exactly, and during the First World War, the engines were not good enough to be the guy that outruns. So up until the last year of the war, it was always who can turn the best. Right. Usually when you had just 2 airplanes in a dogfight, they usually just circled for a minute or two, testing each other who was better in the turn.
Yeah. And then, of course, for a lot of times, what you would have is different airframes were coming out almost. It seemed monthly. A new airframe was coming out from either the Germans or the Allies, and it would make a small difference in things were going. Like I said, except for the German happy time for after 1915 in October, where the Allies basically stood down until they got their hands on an interrupter gear. And the reason they got that on an interrupter gear was strictly because the pilot had come in too low, had been shot down by ground fire. The plane more or less landed intact, right? And they were able to, take it apart and reverse engineer what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
And it was then after that the British came out with it, and all of a sudden now the British airframes actually initially were once again superior, at which point you end up with a major change in the tactics, which was the flying circuses.
And this is also too where an ism was kind of invented. A lot of the pilots who did survive more than a couple of weeks, because that was your life expectancy. If you got that far, you were doing good. The blokes who did have outrageously high kill rates, like 75 and 88 for von Richthofen, they literally wrote the books on dogfighting tactics and all this kind of stuff, and that's partly where you get the term from. Oh, this guy, you got to listen to him because he literally wrote the book on this. Like, so these pilots were going up and it's like, well, I survived that one, and this is how I survived it, and they were writing their tactics out and sharing it with other pilots.
And the most important
and
thing,
if you look at modern airframes, you're really not looking at a dogfight war. But I think that's where the United States itself, we have a weakness. We think we can kill everything from 20 miles away. Sure. What happens when they get closer? Other countries
BVR.
still have the MiG airframe. They can still dogfight. They still have guns. Half of
Yeah,
our
that's-
airplanes don't even have guns, dude.
That was part of doctrine, really, because like the whole idea was you had the F4 Phantom and the Delta Dagger and things like that were designed to shoot missiles out at great ranges and all this. And when you hit Vietnam, you've got, oh no, you must get close enough to identify the aircraft. By that stage, you're now going to get into a turn and fight. So you got doctrine that kind of fucked you up there. But no, the whole point of having a gun on the airplane is still valid.
Exactly. And what we really also learned with the F4 is that we think that missiles are reliable. No. During the entire Vietnam War, it was 11% of the missiles that actually left the rail hit their target. And the majority of the time when they left the rail, they just fell.
Yep,
just like a
Sparrows. Yep, Sparrows were always dropped in pairs because one would fall away and one might work.
Yeah, in Vietnam, ripple fire became a thing that they would, and of course you only have so many missiles that you're carrying. So after you ripple fire a couple times, you're pretty much done for the day.
No, in MC, in Vietnam, they went from the 22 back to the 16 or the F-15 because they needed that airframe. They needed the guns, right? Or am I mistaken?
No. You're talking about the difference between the F4s and then what they came up with later on. The F4 was the workhorse that we went into Vietnam with. But the reason for that was, you got to remember something. People during the start of the Vietnam War, they were not expecting dogfighting. They really went in with the idea of, okay, if there's going to be a dogfight, we'll just use missiles. But they were also looking at it from the standpoint of having a single platform that would also be able to deliver bombs, and that's what they were looking to do.
Well, not only that, but what they thought of shooting other airplanes down, and we still haven't really gotten to this point, was the idea of a BVR kill, beyond visual range.
Yep.
So you'd be told eventually, you'd be told by an AWAC, oh, there's something out there, and then you just let go of a missile and it goes away and it does the kill. The technology does the work. So we got rid of things like the Top Gun school. That completely bit us in the butt. And all of this boils down, all of this sees its heritage straight back to the World War I aces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when they did reintroduce the Navy Fighter Weapons School, or Top Gun, they basically went to a 4-to-1 kill ratio. It was 4 enemies to 1 American aircraft. But we were going on about ad hoc in-field modifications to aircraft before, and they actually did in fact do that to the F-4 Phantom during Vietnam. They put an M61 Vulcan gun in a pod and mounted that down the center line of Phantoms. They quickly realised that because it wasn't slave to the radar or anything like that, that was basically only really useful for strafing when you're not really relying on accuracy. And then the E model come around where they did finally mount a chin-mounted Vulcan in the nose. So, yeah, ad hoc things still exist.
Okay, so I have a question for you, aviation nerds. Okay, you have Top Gun for the Navy. What about the Air Force and the Army?
There's an Air Force equivalent. I just can't remember the name of it. And the Navy Fighter Weapons School has actually changed its name too, and has moved from Miramar to somewhere else. It's on the West Coast still.
The Army is not allowed to dogfight.
The Army is not allowed to fly any fixed-wing aircraft. The agreement was made, I think, back in '68. But the Army cannot fly any fixed-wing anything, and the Air Force cannot fly rotor wing. Period.
And the Navy just laughed their asses off, and we're like, we're gonna do both.
The Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard can do anything they want.
Well,
the
there's
Marines,
there's limits to what they're doing, though, simply because from a carry perspective, they don't have any kind of longevity. They don't have any kind of distance or on time, on station, capability. They're limited in their resources because their purpose is limited.
The USMC
is the United States Naval Aviation still using the F-16?
No, they never did.
The F-16? No, the U.S. Navy's never used the F-16.
It was originally designed to be carrier capable.
It can't go slow enough.
It did have an arrestor hook, and it did have strengthened landing gear. They changed their minds later on and said the landing gear was so you can use unprepared runways. But there was a thought right at the beginning of the F-16 program that it was maybe designed to go off aircraft carriers, but that never eventuated.
You might be thinking of the F-17 prototype that it was going up against, which actually did end up being the F-18.
No. The 16 did have the strengthened landing gear and the arrestor hook right at the beginning.
I'm kind of partial to the 22. It still has a gun platform, if I remember correctly, which I like, and I think it's the last one that they put a gun platform on.
No. They're putting a gun on the F-35, which is a bit stupid because it's not supposed to go anywhere near anything that it can use a gun with. Anyway.
The F-35 really, we'll get credit. After this, let's go back to the First World War. But the F-35 really is a turkey. It's a committee-designed airplane to do everything, and anyone who knows anything about aviation, an airplane that is good for short takeoff and landing will be slow. An airplane that is good for high speed can't go slow. If it can carry a lot, it can't turn worth squat. Everything with an airplane design is a compromise.
Yep. If you sling a lot of shit on an aircraft, you can't hide it. If you want to stick everything inside of it, you're limited in what you can carry. There's pros and cons, and all the cons just outweigh all the bloody pros all together. But just real quick, just for Dodge, the US Marine Corps is different from the Army, Navy, and Air Force because they're designed to be basically all three services in one thing as their own self-contained assault group. They're not supposed to be reliant on the Army for, air travel. They're not supposed to be reliant on the Air Force for air cover, and they're not supposed to be reliant on the Navy for naval warfare and transport and whatnot. So they've got all their own gear.
How do they say it in A Few Good Men? We love you, Navy boys. Every time we have to go fight, you give us a ride.
They've got all their own ships and shit, so they're all assault transports and whatnot too. So,
they're still under the Department of the Navy.
Yeah. Anyway, back to World War One.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, and back to World War One. So let's talk about the Red Baron. What made him the legend that he became? Just a lot of kills? Was that it, or did he have that charisma, that pop?
There
He
were a lot
had
of aspects about Baron Manfred von Richthofen that did play into his favour. He was a very good shot. He was a hunter from from his childhood, so he had the marksmanship and all this kind of stuff. He had good reaction times, and they reckon if any other time in history he would have been a brilliant race car driver, because it's a similar type deal with that. Just you're not flying in the air. He did have a lot of charisma. He was very well liked. There were a lot of people who were volunteering to join his little squadron. There were very lot of huge aspects about that bloke that all played together.
he also really cared about his men, always
Mm.
pushed them for excellence, and continued to tell them until after he was injured that they're there to shoot down airplanes. That one scene in, can't remember what movie, I think it's called The Baron or something, where one guy is chasing some British airplane around the airfield, shooting him, and the airplane's still smoke, and he's just trying to get it to the ground. When the man finally lands, Richthofen pulls him out, shoves him up against the airplane, and tells him, "We're here to shoot down airplanes, not kill people." Also, Richthofen, just like all the best aces ever, had way above average eyesight.
Oh, that's another thing here too. So he could see shit from like way past everybody else too.
Exactly,
Yeah, no,
and
and that's
still
something
today.
I really like about World War One. Dogfights. It was that History Channel show. They used computer animation, right, to map out
Dogfights, yeah.
the battle. Yeah. Um, the downward spiral of the dogfight from World War One is just amazing. They're drifting in the air. It's like watching a dirt track race. You know what I mean?
Yep. Yeah.
Exactly. And still, it's not as much today with AWACS, but even into Vietnam, it was still very true. If the person who sees the other guy first wins the dogfight.
Well,
Yep,
generally, yes, you get shot by the person you didn't see, not the one you do.
there's even an Israeli ace from the 6-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, and he only became an ace from being belligerent, fucking insubordinate little fuck, but also too because he could see well past just about everybody else in his squadron. There's
Ron
even
Ronan.
that guy. There's even one instance where he was saying, "There's planes out there," and they're like, "We can't see shit." And he's like, "I'm telling you, there's fucking planes out there." And then a few minutes later, it's like, "Holy shit, there are planes out there."
Yeah, the thing though to remember about all this, especially in World War One, was with Mannheim, right? Was the fact he was also very aggressive, and what I mean, but it was an intelligent aggression. It wasn't the aggression that people think about going, okay, I'm always going to go into battle or anything like that. No, he was always willing to go after them, go after the enemy. He was always searching for the enemy to drive it home, and he would get very close. In comparison to what most people did, he would get close to the enemy before he opened fire. All right, which is how he got many of his kills. But he wasn't willing to push the point. If it became disadvantageous, he would leave, and he would make sure that his people left. All right. If you outnumber the enemy, great. If you have parity with the enemy, great. If you don't outnumber the enemy, well, but they don't see you, then go in there, get your kill, and then get the hell out. Okay, but you don't go in there when the enemy sees you and that there's more of them than you, and you just drive on in anyway. It wasn't a reckless type of aggression.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, no, and Falcon, I want to go back to what you said. You had drove the point home about, caring about, dropping an aircraft, not killing the person. What about the dichotomy here when you're looking at, the noble air war compared to, well, the trenches? There was a different mentality here, wasn't there?
There was not so much at the beginning. Towards the beginning, it was still the idea, like 14 and a little bit into 15, there was the idea of it being an honorable war, and Manfred always kept that throughout the war. He always saw himself as the modern knight. Like there's one case that it is on the, it's one of the episodes of Dogfights, the one about the First World War. There's the French ace of aces. Basically, this German he's shooting at him. The French ace flies right over him, upside down, and he can see immediately that, holy crap, he's just seen that I am completely defenseless. I am I'm but prey now, because he's looking down on him and he sees him banging on his machine gun with a hammer. After that, he flew back over, waved his hand at him, and pulled away and dove into the cloud. He was not willing to shoot a defenseless man.
No, and that's something that would have never happened in the trenches. They're slinging gas at each other at this point, man. And in the air, they are still acting like, well, nobility.
Now, having said that, right, now we've had 100-odd years to think about it and all this kind of stuff. You can call a little bit of bullshit in some of the things that were said at the time, because realistically, you're flinging 1,200 rounds a minute at somebody, and they're moving and stuff. You're not really going to be able to guarantee that you're not going to hit the pilot and all this kind of stuff. And that's where you had a lot of high death rate. Like I said, it was, if you joined the Royal Air Corps or something, like the Royal Army Air Corps, you maybe had 2 weeks left.
Exactly, and it stayed that way for the majority of the war, and actually got worse with the Germans towards the end. One of their best pilots, Ernst Udet, in his triplane, James McCudden wrote in his diary that he could tell that Udet was wounded because he stopped maneuvering, and Udet was he was an extremely skilled pilot, but he stopped maneuvering and he just, for the most part, stayed straight and level. And then, of course, he probably just passed out onto his stick and dove straight into the ground.
Oh, blood loss. Yeah. I'm going to step away for a second and use the restroom. But as I do, I would like you guys to talk about the American volunteers, the ones that came over and served with the Royal Air Force and the French Air Force, respectively. They volunteered with no obligation whatsoever to a foreign country to fight a war they had no business in fighting.
Well, just
there's something inherently stupid, but yet noble about that.
Well, just real quick, before we do get onto that, let's segue that with an American ace, Eddie Rickenbacker. Go.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, Falcon or MC, go ahead. I'm going to step away for just a second. I'll be right back, guys.
Honestly, I know more about what Rickenbacker did after the war than during the war.
Because what's more important is what he did after the war in comparison to what he did before the war, or during the war, rather. The first thing about that people have to remember about the Americans, all right, when it came to this, was with the wars going on. The war began in 1914. The United States does not go into the war, okay, until 1917, right? So the war goes on for 3 years, long before America actually declares war against Germany and the Axis, or the Central Powers, as they were known at the time. So if you were a young man, though, and you wanted to fly, because the one thing that's very true is man's dream of flight always has always caught the imagination. All right, the idea of freedom and flight. All right, so this was always an area where it was rife, all right, for propaganda. And when you start talking about World War I, one of the things that quickly became apparent was, if you wanted to get your name in the paper, okay, either you had to be a high muckety-muck general, or you could make a name for yourself by being a pilot. Right? You didn't have to be high, super high rank. If you were better than everybody else, people would be interviewing you All right, so there was a lot of appeal for that, for the young American boys who wanted to go over there and make a name for themselves.
And you
Right.
got to remember, the 10 years leading up to the war, really close to 20 years, it was basically the entire country was trying to make the airplane. You had the aerodrome, you had quite a few other things, and then a couple guys from Ohio make one, but it's still contested for almost 10 years. But imagine growing up and reading about this for half your life in the papers, just about airplane, this flying thing, this other guy flying in his machine and all that kind of stuff. Oh, and to you, flying is freedom. You get to go up and go wherever you want.
Well,
So
you have people making their flights. You end up. I mean, it was something that caught the kid's eyes. That everyone, his dreams of being able to be free and to just go up in the clouds and get away. And you get in your plane and you go 200 miles. And within 200 miles, you could do that in less than a day. You didn't have to wait for a bus or a train, all right, in order to do this. You could just get in there and go. I mean, the idea behind it was so powerful, right? So enamoring, it was such things. So, and then as the beginning, as 1914 drags on, as 1915 drags on, and all you'd have is mass slaughter. 1916 is going on, and in the Western Front, where the news is there's not news except for death and dying. There's no good news, and then all of a sudden you have, of course, the pilots. The pilots are unique. The pilots, the myth that you were talking about Manfred. Baron, the Red Baron, all of that. They're the knights. This is where they could get honor. This is where the traditions of where they came and started the war in could still be carried on, in their opinion. All right, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, and funnily enough, with all of these, things that everyone can see with the airplane leading up to the war, the higher ups still had the same attitude with the airplane like what they did with the machine gun. Oh, it's not going to be a problem. It's not going to be a big thing. And yeah, it wasn't until these people started showing them exactly like what it can do. It's like, oh, hey, we slap some machine guns on it. This will be terrifying.
Well, exactly. Both inventions fundamentally changed warfare as we know it. And remember, also for the Americans, the French would pay you well, and of course, the American population still saw the French in a good light. So,
yes,
heck, you're helping the French, and they'll pay you well. Oh, and you'll be famous.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
That was a huge issue.
Well, no, and the thing is, if you're looking at World War II, the new thing there was the paratroopers. Easy Company, the 501, the 502. That was the new thing. Well, World War I, just being a pilot was fucking new, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
exactly.
That was the big deal. And in World War II, they had to give you an extra $20 to sign up to jump out of an airplane. In World War I, they were jumping at the fucking opportunity to climb in there.
Well,
I mean,
and the sad part, though, is in the war, from that perspective, from the American perspective, is even when we go into the war, we are so unprepared as a nation that throughout the entire war, all the squadrons of Americans were flying either French or British airframes. There were no American-made airframes in France, all right, that were being flown in a squadron.
Exactly.
Well, yeah,
And the idea of shipping an airplane.
Didn't Royce start as a airplane company?
Rolls-Royce. No, they were a car company.
Exactly.
No?
And also, guys, you got to remember, shipping an airplane over there really wasn't practical because the wooden airframe just simply couldn't survive getting over there. It'd get over there and it'd be so warped that it was useless.
Just to answer Dodge's question, Rolls-Royce started off as a car company, and they started lending their engine knowledge to the aviation industry. That's basically how they became aircraft engine manufacturers, all right back to those days.
Yeah, it's part of the technology that's changed. The engines, oh my goodness, the engines went from just these underpowered, for all intents and purposes, lawnmower engines. All right,
Not
when you
even
think
that.
of a lot of that, to really truly powerful engines. All right, that had hundreds of horsepower. All right, and of course it just advances from there from that technology on. But it took, I mean, throughout the war, there was, like I said, there was always a technological curve that both sides were fighting. It was a technological race. One would make a breakthrough, then the other one would catch up and then make it their own breakthrough, and it would go back and forth like this. And you ended up with a fight between the manufacturers of whether or not maneuverability is more important or power is more important. The speed to go in and get away, is top speed more important, or is the ability to turn inside the enemy more important?
And it's still that way.
And both have advantages given certain circumstances. So it's a matter of what makes you an ace is whether or not you can arrange for those circumstances for yourself with the airframe that you have.
Yeah, there was even a British type that literally looked like they'd slapped a propeller on the front of a Rolls Royce. It literally had like a whole bonnet section, radiator grille, and everything like that, like you'd have on the front of a Rolls Royce. Now, there are advantages to that because it was a powerful car engine. Yeah, you got more balls and horsepower out of it, but it also needed a lot of ancillary sort of parts like oil coolers and radiators and stuff like that. Very
It couldn't
vulnerable
turn worth
pieces of equipment.
squat.
Exactly, that's another thing too.
And what MC you were saying a second ago about the advancement in engines, when the Wright brothers, they tried to get an engine from, they mailed everybody. They wanted an engine that weighed 100 pounds and made 10 horsepower. Everybody said it's impossible. They made an engine that could make 14 horsepower, weighed less than 100 pounds, but they had to get special super high octane gasoline, 40 octane. And then just think of it, less than half a century later, we have 18-cylinder, 2,000 horsepower engines burning 130 octane low lead. In the First World War especially, there was just holy crap, the advancement. Like from the beginning of the war, they wouldn't make a half decent scooter engine, but at the end of the war, you actually had a good aircraft engine.
Well, and that goes back to another issue. I mean, there's lots of technology that was available if everyone understood how it could be utilized. But all these things were being used as experimental type of things. For example, I've postulated repeatedly, look, if you have an airplane and you stick a radio in the airplane and you attach those airplanes in a squadron to do artillery spotting, when you do an advance now, when you go over the top, you would be able to tell, okay, this area is getting bogged down because of artillery machine gun bunkers over here. They could have then just radioed in and shifted the artillery just with that aspect alone. But no one was even thinking about putting radios in these planes until much later, until almost the end of the war. Which goes to another thing. These guys were flying in formation. Yeah, they were waving at one another because, quite frankly, they had no other way to communicate.
Exactly. And another thing about communication, the only way you knew that guy was your flight lead or your squadron lead, usually squadron lead, was either he painted his airplanes as a like yellow or red or something, or usually there's a streamer off his left wing.
Yes, and that's where you do see a lot of colour schemes and stuff like that. There's a lot of what looks like camouflage, and if you ever see the colour photo of it, they're pretty iridescent colours, and you're like, how are you going to hide a plane with it like that? It wasn't for camouflage, it was so that your own blokes could see who you were.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, when you're thinking about it, it
also was
the Red Baron was called the Red Baron was called the Red Baron very simply because he could be seen. All right, exactly. And in fact, all of his group painted their planes red, so they knew who they were. They knew who they were. Now it was pretty obvious with the triplanes, the Fokker triplanes, right? What he's flown at the end. But I mean, he didn't begin his time in the war in those things. That was toward the end.
He started off reconnaissance. He moved to an Albatross 2, which was he did the majority of his kills in, and I still argue it was all around a much better airplane than the DR1.
Well, another aspect of him painting his triplane red was partially so as he could be seen by his own people, but also partially he'd got that reputation by that stage, and it was like if you saw a red plane on your ass, you're pretty much screwed. So keep away from the guy with the red stuff on him.
Exactly, and that continued all the way into for the United States into Vietnam. In fact, the Germans, especially during the Second World War, still did it, and they usually painted the nose of like a 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190 yellow.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And the Russians were doing the same thing as well. Their aces during World War II, they had gigantic slogans in Cyrillic written down the side, and sometimes it'd be just like their love for the Communist Party. There'd be some of them would be "Get fucked, you dirty German cunt." This is bloody Slobodan Milosevic. I'm coming to fucking rape your children. Stuff like that. Yeah.
Exactly, stuff like that.
Well, yeah, no, and
I
was just reading about the Lafayette. I can't say that second word. God damn it.
Escadrille.
Escadrille.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess there was about 30 American pilots who flew for that squadron. About 14 or 13 of them died in action. Compared to the 2-week lifespan expectancy from our Aussie friend here, I'd say the American pilots were pretty damn good.
Yeah. Well,
there was also the cowboy mentality.
Yeah, I also got to make a clarification here. When we say that the Americans were volunteers, they were still getting paid. The whole aspect of the volunteer part of it was that they took up the offer pretty much. There was like, hey, go to France, earn a shit ton of money, shoot a few Germans. Do you want to do it? And the volunteer part was the bloke saying either yes or no.
You're absolutely right. And the fact remains they were there to fight, and it was pretty much another foreign legion for the French at that point, right?
Effectively, yeah, pretty much.
Well, and what you were saying, back to what you were saying a second ago about the painting airplanes to colors like that, there's also the last point of basically of taunting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, come and get me. No, here I am. Come and get me.
Yeah, but you had to. Well, there was that aspect of it. Yeah, but it did have an effect. But then again, it also, what happens when they decide, okay, we're all coming to get you?
Well, it mostly just worked with the rookie. Hey, I can get that guy'd be easy to kill, and then later he's thinking, oh shit.
Mm-hmm.
Right after the other guy, right after the German's now on your tail, and you're up a river full of excrement, and you just lost your paddle.
Right. There's a British sort of saying that's mainly a Royal Air Force one, and it goes with the whole thing of why the British didn't go with the stealth aircraft and they went with the Eurofighter. It's like, so what? You can see us. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. I love that little saying from the RAF. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough.
Yeah, well, no, and the thing though remains, Falcon, you were bringing up the cowboy mentality from the Americans. Yeah, we have a lot of that. We are known to be loud, obnoxious, and full of ourselves. We also back it up.
We're also known for having, and this is also why aviation has been so appealing to this country. In our culture, we greatly hang on to our freedom, much more than anyone else.
You kind of realize that cowboy mentality is the reason why occupational health and safety is a big thing in the rest of the world. We kind of take our cues from Americans. Oh, they had this accident, right? Okay, what don't we do?
Okay, we'll take back our our lever action rifles. We'll take back the airplane, most automobiles. Okay, why don't we just start taking stuff back from you guys? There's a lot you owe us.
Oh, I'm actually
Yeah,
waiting.
electricity, bitch.
No, I'm actually waiting for the part in the OH&S fucking part of the doctrine where it says rule number 1: don't wave your cowboy hat in the air above your head and yell yee-haw while you're doing this.
Rule number 2: go fly your own kite with a key on it, you cunt.
Well, it's kind of hard to make that comment when once again, like I said, by the time that the Americans entered the war, our airframes were so backwards, to be honest. Yeah, there's the aspect that Falcon was talking about, where obviously wood would warp, but the reality is we had no modern airframes ready for war.
We had there was nothing pushing us to advance our technology.
Yeah, and that's
So
another aspect.
You guys had things like the Fokker Eindecker. We couldn't make a monoplane work.
Yeah, and that's another aspect. Well, that's another aspect that I keep bringing up, is that, like, with these new technologies that are coming in, no one actually sees it, and especially if you're not in the war, you're definitely not fucking looking into it, because, well, why do we need it?
No, I mean it's interesting because even what's bad about it is that if you go into World War II, America starts World War II with once again airframes that weren't ready for
Brewster Buffalo.
Weren't ready. And what was really upsetting about that is it's not that we didn't have the airframes. We had better airframes out there. All right, we just didn't put them in production. People forget this.
Yeah, by Pearl Harbor, you guys had fucking Packard motored P-51s. They weren't the D model, but they were still P-51s.
Yeah, they were running the Allison engine, which the Allison we didn't put a lot of money into developing really good engines. So we had things like the Allison, where it was a decent engine when you were down low, but as soon as you started getting up above 15,000, 10 or 15,000. It really, really became just a dog.
That's when they went to the Packard engine, which was basically an American version of a Rolls-Royce Merlin.
But even before the war began, we had already developed the gull wing plane. What was that?
The F4U Corsair.
The Corsair.
Gull.
We already had the Corsair. They had already developed it. They just decided, well, we don't want to go with it. And the reason they didn't want to go with it, all right, was simply because, well, we can't land it because it was the Navy's design. We can't land it very easily on an aircraft carrier. We couldn't figure that out until the British showed us how to do it.
And also in our own defense, the F4U was a very, very nose-up airplane, and the whole reason for that inverted gull wing was to put a absolutely massive prop on it to actually be able to use the R2800 engine to its full potential.
Still, to go into World War II, go into World War II without that plane in comparison, and going with like Farty was saying, with just the Buffaloes, knowing that it's going to get its ass kicked, knowing that it's inferior completely, when we could have. There's no reason for Pearl Harbor not to have been flying these things from their airfields, not to have been flying Corsairs from their airfields, aside from the mentality of the Admiralty and the mentality of our politicians at that time.
Exactly. It's not as short in term as naval strategy is, simply because it takes a lot less time to build airplanes, but the air strategy is also a build strategy.
That's right. You can't do what you want if the plane can't do it.
Exactly. I can't do 400 knots in a crop duster. The thing can't go past 2.
That's right.
The engine could drag it. The airframe can't do it.
You can
Okay,
you can take a straight winged aircraft above Mark 1. Whether you've got any wings left after that's another story.
well, here's a question for you aviation nerds. Who made the engine for the Mustang?
Well, that's the Packard. Well, originally it was Allison,
It's
and then it went to Packard, which was the basically the American Rolls-Royce Merlin, which was in the Spitfire.
the funny thing about that. We built actually a more powerful more powerful Merlin. Also part of that was we actually did have better alloys for building engines.
And also, too, the laminar flow wing also helped a lot
Yeah,
too.
but the British,
Exactly.
the British at the beginning of that agreement refused to actually give the full plans for the Merlin engines.
Exactly. Because of that, the Packard built engines and the Rolls-Royce built engines are not compatible. You can't take a piston out of one and stick it in another.
But that just shows you that was a problem that the British industry had. It wasn't because the British were like, we're going to screw those Americans over. It was a problem within the British industries themselves. They refused to work together for the longest time. The British industries refused to work together when it came to designs of airframes.
Well, the Merlin engine was like a peak of fucking engine technology for the British at the time, and it was so lauded over. There was even fights between Fighter Command and Bomber Command. Oh, we want more Spitfires. No, we need the Merlins for the Lancasters. Fuck the Lancasters. We can put 24 Spitfires up for one of your Lancasters. No. We're having the Merlins for the Lancasters. No, fuck off. We need them for the Spitfires.
In fact, there was such a pride for that while the P-82s were being developed towards the end of the war to escort B-29s to Japan, right when the war ended and there was only 22 of them built with them, the British said, nope, no more Merlins. So all but 22, including the 2 prototypes of the twin Mustangs, all had Allisons. Simply because the British said, no, we want our Merlins.
Anyway, let's get back to World War I, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
That's my fault, too. I blame myself for this as well.
No. This is the problem. This is the inherent problem with World War One. It spews everywhere.
Exactly. It said so many things that we see in the air today come straight out of the First World War.
It's not just the air, it's on the land and on the ocean.
Exactly. And we're still teaching. All fighter doctrine still is based on the original stuff written by the aces.
That's why rule number 1 is still rule number 1.
Well, the other big rule that was very important in the air war, all right, was the fact that you had to put your head on a swivel. You could not get lazy when you were flying a mission. If you were like, okay, I'm looking around, I'm having a lazy kind of day, you had to be looking around, and you had to be quite well aware. If one of your rules is from an enemy is to try and attack out of the sun, you had to be quite aware of where the sun was in relationship to your plane and constantly check to see, okay, if something was flying out of there. Otherwise, you're flying along. Next thing you know, is you're headed for the ground, and you don't even know what happened.
Yep, you are the radar.
And you never be predictable, and you never stay straight and level for too long.
Yep, you are the radar. That's it. No AWACS, no fucking onboard targeting systems. That's it. You are it.
It goes back then to the some of the tactics being used by the flying circus. One of the things that they would do is they would send 2 or 3 planes that would be the bait. And they would send them off there to be the bait. And these were their best pilots. These were the ones that knew how to fly. All right. And what they would do then is they'd have a good 5 or 6, all right, hanging back, waiting for them to get jumped. So then as the enemy lined up to try and jump them, the rest of the circus would come flying in out of nowhere. All right. To make these kills. And it was this is something else that was developing too. This shows you the changes. Is the tactics of the air war were constantly in flux. And even that carries on over, of course, into even World War II, where tactics changed dramatically, all right, within the airframes.
And I'm
Well,
going to be a
not
dick and
just
jump even
not
further again too. Hang on, just real quick. So going to be a
okay.
dick and jump further again, real too, into Vietnam. The North Vietnamese had a very similar tactic. They'd send a couple of planes, knowing that the Americans had to identify the plane before they could attack, which put them into a dogfight. And they'd just go into a big circle, and this is called a MiG wheel. And
Hmm.
while these Phantoms are too busy trying to chase their own tails with these MiGs, a whole bunch of other ones would come in from higher up and dive into this wheel, and next thing you know, your 4 Phantoms now got 8 MiGs behind them.
And to take it a little bit back to Korea, well, back in time to Korea, the old rule of if you're not cheating, you're not fighting is still very true, and deception is rule number one. The night fighter, which of course comes out of the Second World War, but really started to really come of its own in Korea. There was one case of a Marine Corps F-3D Skynight, straight wing, twin engine jet airplane, nothing special as far as airplanes are concerned, even for the day. It sees a MiG-15, goes real tight in it, and his nav lights are on. Something is not right. He's been lured into a trap. Meanwhile, two MiG-15s are diving on him from up high. Same thing that the flying circus did.
And it's just interesting you brought up the Skynight, because that's a different change in tactic completely there. That plane, as you said, was nothing special. It was literally a straight wing thing. They chucked some jets on it and they had some cannons on it. But the big part about it was it had a radar on board. It could search out its
two
own
radars.
targets. Yeah,
a forward-facing and an aft-facing, and they called it Willie the Whale because it was this fat black thing that couldn't get out of its own way.
It looked like an intruder, but with just a bit more fuselage. So yeah, it could literally prowl at night in the darkness, paint it all black and shit, and be unseen, and just creep up on an enemy completely unawares at night, and just get in behind him and just gank the cunt. And before he knew it, he's blowing up. And
earlier,
wasn't designed to dogfight. It wasn't designed to dogfight or drop bombs accurately or anything like that. It was just designed to creep up on people in the night, be unseen, shoot them without them knowing, and then bugger off.
And that thing traces its lineage back to the P-61 Black Widow, which was the size of a medium bomber.
Yep.
Absolute massive thing, armed to the teeth, painted black, and it did the same exact thing. And it was the first aircraft ever designed solely for night fighting. But it traces its heritage back to the First World War, where there were some night fights that happened. Normally what happened with a night fight is Zeppelins were bombing, or British airships were bombing, or Gothas or something was, and a handful of guys said, screw not flying, I'm going to go and kill these MFers. And they get in their airplanes and they go up, even though they were told, even though both sides said multiple times, do not fly at night, simply because those lights on the ground and the lights in the sky, they look identical. Trust me, you cannot fly at night VFR and nor just straight and level and realistically maintain orientation.
It dicks with your depth
at a
perception.
dogfight. Exactly. And you can't trust your inner ear. That thing will kill you.
Especially at night. That happens even nowadays. You watch a couple of air crash investigations just to find out where pilots have been lied to by their instruments. The plane's in like a 50-degree bank or something like that, and they think they're flying straight and level because their instruments are telling them wrong.
Well,
by their instruments, they're
quick.
listening to their inner ear. A friend of
Quick,
mine a few weeks ago, that happened to him. But yeah, please back to World War One.
Well, no, Jacob says, Mad Dog, talk about how the Squirrels took command of the 1st American Battalion. I am not high on acid either, if that's what you're wondering. What the fuck? I think he is high on acid. What's he talking about?
Unit mascot.
No, seriously, the Squirrels. What the fuck?
It's a story I don't recognize, so I don't know.
It sounds similar to this fucking turtle. There's even a bulldog that's a master sergeant in the Marines. Like there was this turtle that was on this one. I think it was a British warship. It lived for like 120 12 years or some shit like that. It saw the Boer War, World War One, Two, Vietnam, and all this kind of shit. And I think it only died a few years ago. But it was had rank and fucking got respect. And if the ship sank, it was supposed to be rescued.
The Russians did that with a bear. They actually made the thing a lieutenant.
Yeah, and there's a bulldog in the U.S. Marine Corps. I'm not entirely sure where the Marines have got him now, but it's stuffed and it's got a little jacket with its medals and shit and its rank insignia. It's a master sergeant or a staff sergeant, one of the two, and it's in a Marine facility somewhere on show as a memorial. Yeah.
Could be.
That's what it sounds like to me, man.
Then again, it could just be the people watching freaking cartoons and saying "squirrel."
Or they could be just screwing with you.
Slappy the squirrel does Private Benjamin.
Smoke a little bit too much weed. Oh yeah, the weed did it.
Shit, I hate it when them bloody squirrels get into me staff. They run around thinking they're fucking generals. No, it does actually sound like he's going to have to clarify a little bit more. But to me, yeah, that initially on the face of it sounds like it's just a unit mascot. But they do give rank and actually has respect and all that kind of stuff of the rank.
Oh, as a funny side note, earlier, MC, when you brought up the year 1911 with some reference, I actually had and right now do have a 1911 in my hand.
Well, it's not the same kind of 1911 I think that they were using in World War One, though.
It's 90% the way, but I still think it is better.
You're just enjoying it a little too much.
Yeah, no, I heard
2-inch grouping at 25 yards. I'm freaking happy.
Did you just manipulate it? Yeah, I heard that. Fucker. I want a gun. This is bullshit.
I dropped the magazine and cycled the action. Oh, that's another interesting thing. Other than if I remember correctly, the United States was one of 2 countries that fielded a semi-automatic pistol.
Yes.
The Germans had the Luger.
Yeah, and the Yanks went in with the 1911.
Yeah, no, and that gun is still one of the most passed down family heirlooms from at least the World War II era is the German Luger. So that's an interesting piece of information.
It stayed into commercial production until the mid 90s.
Well,
up until about 20 years ago.
Little side note: there's an American Medal of Honor winner. I can't remember his name, but he got it because he fought off an attack just using his 1911. He didn't have time to keep racking his bolt and his rifle, so he ditched that and he just started popping people off with his 45.
What was the name of the guy? They did the movie about him, the sharpshooter, right? Where he was down in pretty much surrounded completely, right? And held everybody off by himself.
That wasn't Chris Kyle, was it?
I think.
Or are you thinking about the guy from Vietnam?
That would be Carlos Hathcock, maybe. I think it might be.
There are a number of if you read any of the winners of the Congressional Medal of Honor, you're going to be amazed at what it takes to get one.
Oh yeah, one of the most common ways to be awarded one is the grenade rolls in and you put yourself on it. And of course, it kills you, but it saves everyone around you.
Basically, it's like the Victoria Cross. The general description of that is you got to die to win it.
But for all intents and purposes, yeah, the most of the awards for the Congressional Medal of Honor are given posthumously. But if you take a look at some of the things that took place, I mean, in World War I, you have the one American who got a Congressional Medal of Honor out of World War I, of course, is Sergeant York. If you read what Sergeant York did and you start to study what he did, it's flat out unbelievable. Okay,
I'm gonna have to look him up again because I don't remember anything.
The fact that he on his own told his squad to stay down and then basically assaulted an entire trench position by himself. All right, with a frickin' bolt-action rifle. Okay, now think of this, with a bolt-action rifle. All right, so to win these things was quite it's quite a feat. You've got the kind of heroism that it takes, or the kind of I don't give a shit attitude that it's going to take to get that, to where you're like, I'm totally ignoring my own mortality because I've got to do something. All right, is what gets you a Congressional Medal of Honor or a Victoria Cross. And most of the time, it's like Farty said, you don't win it and still survive.
Exactly. I hate to refer to a fictional movie, but it's just like what some congressman in the movie Shooter says. I did something foolhardy that saved a bunch of lives.
Yeah, and a lot of it does come down to the full realization, right, we're dead anyway, so I'm either going to crawl into a ball and fucking let it happen, or I'm going to try and do something about it. And you'll find that most of these people, when they do go through these situations, especially like if you assault in a trench line or something like that single-handedly, there is a hell of a lot of, holy shit, why am I still alive? Fucking, all right, keep going. All right, see how far we get. And then when it's over, they're like, how the fucking hell did I live through that? But you really don't really think about it at the time. You just sort of like, right, well, okay, this guy's here. I've got to kill him before he kills me. And then I've got to move around. And I've got to do this and I've got to do that. And you're too busy focused on what you're actually doing to be worried about. Like, and then, like, in quite a few occasions, if they do survive, they get out the other side and they look back at what they did and they go, fuck, didn't think I did all of that.
Exactly. During the Second World War, in the Pacific Theater, there was it's part of one of the episodes of Dogfights. There was a crew, a B-17 crew, that because of their lack of discipline, they didn't maintain stuff worth squat. They were put on the very bottom of the list for new airplanes. So they start going to look around. We'll find one that we can fly. And why not? What the hell? Let's also sign up for the most dangerous missions that no one else will do. They find this airplane, tail number 12666. Legendary airplane. They sign up for a mission to go and do some photo reconnaissance for a landing in a few days. On the way there, they're attacked by over 20 Japanese airplanes, and during a head-on pass by a Japanese Ki-26, if I remember the designation correctly, Dyna, a twin-engine reconnaissance airplane, the bombardier, mortally wounded, crawls up back into the nose, grabs his twin 30 calibers. The navigator tries to get his attention. He ignores him. He shoots the airplane down, collapses, and dies. The airplane, they came back with the pilot had to be carried out on a stretcher. The bombardier is dead. Pretty much almost every single man on that airplane is wounded. Bits and pieces are missing. This airplane should not have made it back. And it's one of the most highly decorated mission of the Pacific Theater.
Okay, let's get back to World War I again, shall we, guys?
Sorry.
Well, no, it's easy when you're talking about aviation and just start moving through the years and how it all built up. Because, to be honest, airplanes really haven't been around all that long. It's like, an instant, a snap of the finger of human history.
You also look at it. It's the fastest moving technology that we've pretty much ever had in realism. Like, because you got the 1900s where you got the first powered flight. Within 30 years of that, we're starting to get jet engines. In another 20 years, we're in space.
Yeah, and then a few years later, we're on the moon.
Yeah.
You went from an airplane that barely got off the sand in North Carolina with an air density altitude of negative 2,000 feet. Everything was in its favor, to the Saturn V taking off from from Pad 39A in Florida.
One of the largest moving objects we ever got moving, and fucking, it's still one of the most powerful things that we've ever built.
Exactly.
And that was only 50 years, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. This year is 50 years since Apollo 11.
Mm-hmm.
But just the First World War, we went from, again, I'll say it, airplanes that barely could fly. They were basically kites with engines that nobody would even look at today for anything, not even a lawnmower, to airplanes that were actually very maneuverable, and to the point where we're actually able to start doing things like cross the Atlantic nonstop.
Carry a decent payload. Because it's not just bombs. I mean, like, the first thing basically aircraft did as soon as the war ended, they became mail and cargo aircraft.
Exactly. And Eddie Rickenbacker, him through Eastern Airlines, did a tremendous amount for advancement of safety in commercial aviation. Eastern basically built the airline industry.
Mm-hmm. And once again, we crept out of World War I because that's how it tends to go.
Exactly. You can trace so much of today straight back to them.
Mm.
All right, let's talk about the Americans and what they were able to do once they entered the war from the air perspective. Did they really make it in any kind of major impact?
Sort of, kind of, yes, because, well, there was a massive influx of bodies and more pilots and things like that. That always goes to your favour.
It was mostly pilots, engines, and machinery like that. As far as airframes are concerned, there really wasn't anything.
So the impact from that standpoint tends to be fairly negligible as far as the impact of the Americans' entry into the air war goes.
Oh, it was a decisive thing. No, it was decisive. Like, as soon as the Americans did enter World War I, especially in the air war, it was pretty much that point where the Germans could not field enough pilots and planes to compete. It would be a losing attrition war by that stage.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
Oh, and Jacob MC has a good question.
Mm-hmm.
At Mad Dodge, did you already talk about the weird early attempts at detecting airplanes during the war? No, we did not. MC, anything on that?
Yes, actually, yes.
Go ahead, 40.
Some very, very basic and looked very strange, but actually had some credence. Like megaphone horns. Basically, they had arrays of like cone-shaped receiver type deals, and they were passive acoustic detectors that were designed to detect sounds at a great distance, specifically aircraft. A similar thing was even put on the western coast of southern England and Ireland, where there were gigantic concrete sort of concave devices that were designed to bounce sound to a microphone set a certain distance in front of it. Very, very basic detection things like that. The whole air raid pickets and all that hadn't been thought of yet. That's more of a World War II thing. As far as electronics go, there was nothing very existent with that. But yes, he is right. There were some very weird looking devices, and you can see photos of like that. There'd be a German fella with a headset on these two dirty, great big inverted bullhorn, pretty much things, like literally just poking in his ear, and he would literally just turn his head, and as he turned his head, you were supposed to have been able to listen several miles out, and apparently that worked.
Remember, especially into 17 and even more so 18, everyone was getting just desperate. If somebody had an idea, it was tried. Doesn't matter how stupid it sounded, someone tried it.
Yeah, there was a lot of little things, but one of the things that happened, if I'm not mistaken, isn't it World War I where the actual invention of the windsock comes into play?
Yes. Well, that came in pretty much straight away because the first general aircraft that they were using, mainly as reconnaissance and early fighters, pretty much. I've mentioned this in a previous episode. Could realistically only be flown at first light or at dusk when there was very little wind. During
And
the
if
day
there
or in high winds, they couldn't really take off.
and the airfield was a hangar in the middle of the field, and you took off in the direction of the wind, and you did the same for landing. There was
Hmm.
no other option, and still, and that is still today is the most favorable direction. But we can now do things like crosswind landings, whereas especially airplanes like the DR1, nothing other than absolute perfection would work.
Yeah, because as I mentioned earlier too, that these planes were ridiculously light, and this is how they also became so survivable in the air, getting punctured with a shit ton of holes, is because they were so light that they were buoyant anyway. And going back to where we mentioned the first aircraft carrier usage and stuff like that, literally, the if it did have an arrestor hook, and the arrestor wires were literally just cables with a bunch of sandbags on the ends of them, just to give the cable a bit of weight and drag. If not, there was about a dozen blokes standing at the end of the deck, and the plane would come in, pretty much stall and drop onto the deck, and the guys would just grab the plane.
Also, the airplanes were very flimsy. So if they did something like try to land in anything other than perfection, and you hit a wingtip on the ground, yeah, nowadays you'd ground loop, and that can be bad. But back then, the entire airplane is destroyed.
Hmm.
Don't forget, you've also bent your crankshaft and your engine, and you've destroyed a few of the cylinders because of that.
Yep. And probably hurt the pilot in the process.
Yeah, you likely killed the guy. A lot with the Camel, a lot of guys died trying to land the thing.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's about it. I think we've covered enough about the World War One air war. What do you guys think?
Yeah,
There's still a little more, but I'm a bit sort of overloaded now. So
The First World War, aviation was in its infancy, but you can see all of the early attempts with really everything in aviation. Um, it was really a proof of concept for aviation.
I think it was the best thing to say about it is it started with a bunch of adventure boys and left as a profession.
Exactly.
pretty much, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right about that because there was no aircraft licensing or training or rules and regulations. There was no FAA. There was no nothing. Literally, if you built the plane, you could fly it. There was nothing no one can say about it. And if you crash, well, fuck, that's your stiff shit.
In fact, from the year that the First World War ended, it would be 20 years later before any regulations existed, period, in the United States.
And that did lead on to the civilian flying circuses, where you basically had a guy who either built his own aeroplane or got something surplus from the war or something like that, never been taught how to fly, and he's doing stuff like barnstorming, which is flying through barns and doing stunt work like that. All the stuff you see in
Exactly.
the old silent movies. Yeah.
Men like Charles Lindbergh, he took off from Americus in a JN4 Jenny that he just bought, and he soloed it right there.
Hmm. There's another fella that he wasn't in the war or anything like that, but it is still congruent with the whole no training and aspect and all this. And this is just as you had the original FAA. I can't remember what they were called. I'm sure they weren't
Civil
called
Air
that.
Authority.
That'd be it. And this is how early it was because they didn't even have rules for this. This bloke went and stole a plane and landed it on like Broadway in New York City, and just he landed it in the middle of the road, got out, and went into a bar. And the rules back then were so vague and so new that they literally couldn't actually charge him with anything. They could charge him with like public mischief and blocking traffic, and that was about it. But as for stealing a plane and flying unlicensed and all this, there was nothing they could really do about it. And he actually did do something similar a little bit later where he stole a plane and he said he was only going for a joy flight, but got turned around and somehow ended up in Ireland.
Exactly. Over here in the States, the Federal Aviation Administration was established in '52, and back then, and well into the '60s, your check ride to say whether or not you get a pilot's license is put your airplane into an aggravated stall where you spin. It's called a spin, where you stall one wing. The other wing is still flying; it's producing lift, but you have to stall that other wing in order to recover. It's
Tip
an
stall.
interesting and disorienting maneuver.
Well, no, Falcon, that's interesting you bring that up because I did go to flight school actually. And the instructor was telling us, he's like, look, this is not required anymore, but in my day it was. And if you want to do it, you can.
Mm-hmm.
You guys remember Top Gun? And everybody in
fun.
the room smiled. He's like, yeah, remember when Goose died? The flat spin? I'll put you in that and I'll teach you how to pull out.
It's
not
actually
required,
not that
but
hard.
if you want to do it, we'll do it. And that just sounded like fun to me.
Exactly. It really is fun. And you always know the two things you'll know about anybody who is a good pilot or will be is one, they fight until the end. And the best aces during the First World War were just like this. They never gave up. And even into the point where you look back and you see it was absolutely hopeless, they were still fighting. That, and they didn't let their emotions take a hold of them ever. If you get it, you put your some people are going to scream sexism, but if you put your average woman in an airplane and you put it into a spin, she'll lose her mind. A good pilot will not only fall back on his training, but will work the problem and think about it logically.
Well, yeah, and you have to. You lose control up there. It's not like a car where you can just hit the goddamn fucking guardrail. There is no guardrail in the air. And Oz, go fuck yourself. Just saying. No.
I say Sherardi needs to go fuck herself.
Yeah, there's a bit of a misnomer with flat spins and stuff nowadays. Partially the reason why it's not really taught anymore is because mainly the aircraft are designed that they can almost get themselves out of it by themselves. There have been some aircraft that, when they've been testing, that have been so hard to put into a flat spin that they gave up trying to do it.
Exactly.
The F-105 Thunder Chief was really good for that. It'd go into a flat spin, it'd go through 2 revolutions, and it'd just generally pull itself out of it without much manipulation.
Exactly. The old Luscombe 8As, their post-war, Second World War, the Cessna 120s and 140s were all like that, and the 170s. They didn't really want to go into a spin, but when they went into it, if you push them pretty easily, they go into it, but they would recover in a heartbeat. And in fact, that was the idea back then of, if you're going to build an airplane, it needs to, a single engine airplane, it has to spin. Now, with airplanes like the Cirrus, we've gone away with that so much that the Cirrus cannot recover from a spin. In fact, that parachute, that is the only way that the FAA would say, yeah, we can let this airplane fly.
Mm.
Falcon, here's another question as we're starting to wrap it up. This has nothing to do with World War I at all, but it is about aviation. How do you feel about the ultralights and that community where you don't need a pilot's license, but you're still in the fucking air?
I'll let him go, but I've got an
silly.
opinion on this too.
I think it's kind of silly, but I have nothing against it whatsoever. The only thing that the ultralights are really going to come up against next year is can lead on a whole new discussion in of itself, because I think they're just bastardized this. But then again, a blanket, everyone has to have this, is easiest thing for government to do. But they're going to run into a problem with the ADS-B requirement for 2020. I think it's silly. I think the things can't go anywhere. They can't really do much of anything. But if you want to do it, knock yourself out. I have nothing against them.
Me personally, I reckon it should be a little bit more regulated, at least, because just about 90% of the aviation accidents we have in Australia are all ultralights. You got probably about 7%, which might be light aircraft, and then there's a very, very rare, like a regional aeroplane will lose a propeller or something like that. But that's as worse as we got. Basically every fatality we have out here is an ultralight, and you do. Because there's no regulation and all that kind of stuff, but there is that aspect of, well, the ultralight's been sitting in the garage for 10 years, and well, let's go for a flight, and oh shit, the wing fell off, you know.
Well, here in the United States, if I remember correctly, you cannot exceed 40 miles per hour. Your stall speed can't exceed a certain speed. I think it's 26. You cannot be more than 154 pounds dry and without the occupant. It can't carry more than 5 gallons of fuel, and it can only carry one person. The thing, a lot of people think like, oh, your local, the Cessna 172 at the local airport, oh, it's so horrible. Guys, your Honda Civic is so much better at being a projectile than that airplane, and that's an airplane that's in excess of 1,000 pounds. I think it's close to 2.
Wait, you can't be over 150 pounds. When I was looking it up, I thought it said 250.
No, that's a different weight spec, but with no fuel, with no oil, no fluids of any kind, and no pilot. 154.
Wow.
So
it's got to be made
really,
out of like balsa wood and shit.
Normally it's aluminum tubing and fabric. You won't find any metal wings out there. Just they can't make them wide enough.
That's what I don't like. That's why I was looking at it and I'm like, no. I want a fixed wing aircraft. I do not
want a fixed wing.
They flying fucking parachute.
Dude, they are fixed wing. In fact, they are fixed wing, and a lot of very amazing airplanes are covered in fabric. Now they're usually steel, chromoly steel tubing for the fuselage, but they're still covered in fabric. Heck, over in Moultrie, just a few minutes, just about an hour down the road, and about a 20-minute flight, they build bush planes there, and they're still all their fuselages are covered in fabric.
Yeah, no, it's funny about the bush pilots too, is that's another thing my flight instructor said. He's like, look, what you're gonna get here is a 2-year course. You will leave here ready to go be a bush pilot in Alaska. You can pass your pilot's license test and you'll be fine. But if you want to be a commercial pilot, you do need to transfer to a 4-year school. That does need to happen. I was at the community college.
You need to get 250 hours in an aircraft in order to qualify for that. But then again, that's for a commercial pilot's license. Just all that is to say you are proficient in flying for that type of airplane. So let's say you got your fixed wing, your private pilot, and that's it. And you got your commercial. Congratulations, you can fly single engine fixed wing airplanes, little itty bitty general aviation stuff for a living, but you can't go fly that crop duster because you do not have agricultural. You can't go and fly that twin engine turboprop airliner because you don't have the high performance, the multi engine, the complex, or the airline certificates.
I gotta say,
so all the commercial is to say that you're a good enough pilot to be allowed to do this for a living.
Yeah, I gotta say, some of those things that they're doing with some of them bush planes nowadays, they're getting the very ultra low fucking takeoff things. Like that, some of these blokes are Tim the Tool Manning tailoring up their fucking aircraft so they've got like insanely short takeoff runs. Like I'm not kidding, like 10 feet. I'm not kidding.
Exactly. The world record is 10 feet 4 inches in a highly modified Piper Super Cub, and that out of Valdez, Alaska, and it was only modified just for that. And every year in Valdez, there's that competition of who can land shortest, who can take off shortest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, no, the thing is, though, Farty, I think the short takeoff and the short landing is mainly because the bush pilots are flying up in Alaska for the most part. And you're getting your aircraft iced over, and you end up laying your plane down at least once a year, almost every pilot. So
yeah.
you're flying at a low
Well,
altitude because if you lay it down, you don't want to fucking die.
Oh yeah, but
Mad Dogs?
you can get them so fucking slow, you can literally drop them in a parking spot. Literally fly
Mad
in
Dogs?
and just go. Boop.
You have bush flying in almost every single state. Like heck, here in Georgia, we still have it. Over in Texas, same thing over there. But if you accumulate ice on your airplane, there's no way you're going to keep flying. You're done.
Yeah, some of the planes up there have the de-icer on the wings, but a lot of them don't. And you lay it down like a motorcycle at least once a fucking winter. And the way they're doing it in Alaska is that's the only way they're moving food and stuff in is the bush pilots. They are essential up there.
Exactly. Normally, they're Cessna 206 tricycle landing gear 6-person airplanes packed with food, going to places like Nome, where your runway during the winter is a piece of ice. Not kidding. It's the Arctic ice itself. And if the airplanes stop flying, people starve. Up in Canada, there's a company called Buffalo Airways that flies old C-47s and C-46s.
I technically work for them.
Oh,
technically.
Congrats.
Yeah, when they started getting a bit more into the Lockheed Electras and stuff like that, and it was about the time when the RAAF was starting to ditch their P3 Orions, and I approached them and said, "Do you want me to let you know?" And they said, "Yes, please, keep an eye on it for us." So I'm still technically working for them.
Well, congrats. But those guys, if they stop flying, people starve. Generators stop running because they run out of diesel, and then people either starve to death or they freeze to death.
Another good part about Buffalo Airways too is the McBride family. Like even Mikey's really, really into this. He's like into like air heritage and stuff like that. And he's just done a little series where he's got a DC-3 up and running. And it was it spent the rest of its life as a civilian airliner, but it was a D-Day airframe.
Oh yeah, him and a guy that runs a flight channel, Flight Chops, did that. I've actually met Mikey and saw their and seen some of their airplanes. Those airplanes, they're all going off of parts that have been out of production for about 30 or 40 years, but they basically have their own small warehouse just packed to the ceiling with parts.
Yeah, well, that's why they're interested in what I'm doing, because like I was only looking for ancillary parts like engines and landing gear and flaps and shit like that for them, and well, they sort of indicated they wanted full airframes as well, but
they're always in the market.
Yeah, they were really interested in the parts in a big way because, well, the parts you go through like crazy.
Yeah, reciprocating engines, there's a lot of maintenance with them, and that's why the airliners stopped using them. But they're incredibly reliable. And they can do things that the jets and the turboprops just can't do.
Yeah.
But no, we are approaching the 2-hour mark. I think this is about good, really. I mean, I could talk all night about aviation, really. I never did get my pilot's license, full disclosure, but I do love aviation. I know I should have. And now my wife, she won't let me. She's like, flying's too dangerous. I'm like, fuck you.
Flying's actually one of the safest things you can do on the planet.
I was going to say the same thing. It's safer than crossing the street.
Not if Mad Dodge is in the plane.
I know, yeah. My wife knows
or maybe,
me. If she has a point.
Or maybe me if it's something like a Just Aircraft Superstall or one of those, or like is it a Kit Fox, or if it's like a Kit Fox, because I'll be looking down saying, "Ooh, I wonder if I can land there." Hey, Falcon. That's a 20-foot sandbar in the middle of a river. Yeah, it'll be fun.
Yeah, that'd be the excuse that I could use in the future, though, if Dodge gets his license. Like, well, why would you jump out of a perfectly good aeroplane for? What, go parachuting? Yeah, well, Dodge is flying. Okay, so it wasn't funny.
It's kind of an encouragement factor. All right, everybody that's still on the plane, we're going to let Mad Dodge at the controls. See you later.
And everybody jumps out, including the guy who said it.
Then he's first.
Yeah, he's saying
Everyone,
it while
follow
he's
me.
jumping out. If you want to live, you'll follow me.
Yeah, and then the second person jumps out and says, Geronimo. The third person jumps out and says, Geronimo. And then the fourth person's an Indian, jumps out and says, me.
No, okay.
And then, of course, Mad Dodge turns around and says, hey, dude, what was the stall speed in this airplane? Oh, shit.
No, it's funny. The coolest thing the instructor told us was he told us about flying for FedEx. It's actually amazing. So, like, you fly in 2-week cycles. So you can go 2 weeks at the beginning of 1 month, have a whole month off, and 2 weeks at the end of the next, and rinse and repeat. And
it's not as
during your
stressful.
during your time off, you could jump into, well, the jump seat in any airline and just go anywhere in the world you want. It's fucking amazing. It sounds like the best job ever.
Not only that, but it's easier to get into that job than the airlines, and it's easier to keep that job than the airlines. So yeah, you get you used to get the social credit of, oh, I'm an airline pilot, but honestly, guys, the airline pilots, they all hate their jobs, and I don't blame them.
And it's
And
even
job security is
easier.
shit.
It's even easier if you go work for DHL, because I'm not sure whether they've proliferated this through all their hubs, but there's one particular major hub, I think it was in Chicago, where the ILS system with the DHL planes is so sophisticated that basically as soon as the pilot puts it into a landing descent, he just takes his hands off the controls and the plane basically comes in at idle speed. The computers are so sophisticated they can keep the plane moving, and it saves some stupid amount of fuel per year. So you don't even land them.
And taxi, the Boeing 777 and 787, they all can do that. In fact, they do that all the time in Atlanta. And back to the ADS-B thing I mentioned earlier, instead of a blanket, everyone's got to have this, just like it's basically the aviation version of AIS in a boat. Do y'all know about that? It's a transponder where everybody can see what you are, where you're heading, who you are, that kind of thing, on a screen. So the idea is it tells you if someone's getting too close. But normally, unless you are really close to somewhere like Atlanta or Dallas Fort Worth or some insanely busy area, like there's only a handful in the whole country, you're not going to see another airplane. Maybe you'll be flying at 7,000 feet and you see this little crop duster flying at like 500 at most. That's it.
So I guess we're going to wait for the full 2 hours. That's another 2 minutes. So what can we crap on about now?
Well, my wife was just being a bitch, so I can talk about that. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, crap. He's belly aching about the old woman.
Yeah. Well, I figured we'd go full fucking Tim the Toolman Taylor on this one. So MC, women, right?
You're gonna try and drag me into your nightmare? I got one of my own. What are you talking about? I was institutionalized a long time ago.
Well, and you've got a daughter, right?
In
fact, I think I was institutionalized before Mad Dog was even born.
And I'm the smart one. I got rid of mine years ago.
Hey, MC, don't you have like a daughter or two?
I have 2 daughters, yes.
Oh, that crap. Triple the trouble.
No, that he knows of.
You poor SOB.
Oh, Farty is MC your dad?
Shh. Fucking, I wasn't gonna fucking spring it on him until like next year. Shit.
You're still looking for alimony.
Yeah, Dad, I need some money.
Yeah, child support, Dad.
I'm actually probably old enough to be his brother.
Oh shit. Well, I hate to be the one to actually be able to say this. I'm old enough that MC actually could be my dad.
Which means I could be your dad too.
And my dad is my dad's 60, so my dad's even older than MC.
Yep, just barely. But he
Are
is
you
older.
even old enough to drink?
This coming September 23rd, I'll be able to celebrate the 3rd year that since I bought my first pistol. I didn't buy my first drink until like 5 months after I turned 21. But
See,
the day I turned 21, I went and bought a pistol.
I bought my first drink at 16. Anyway.
That is the most hilarious part about this fucking country is that I never actually bought a firearm, yet I've owned several over the years. Everyone gives me firearms here. In a country we're not supposed to have any.
Yeah, they give it to him. Just give. He doesn't really ask or threaten.
No.
Or
Dude,
demand.
That's just like the AR-15 receiver blanks is what the ATF calls it, but the name people usually call them are 80%. I'm looking at one of those. I'm thinking, hey, I could make a gun that the government doesn't know about.
Okay, one day
maybe I'll think about it.
One day when I was working for the Salvos, right, I go to this one place in North Sydney. This guy was donating this very, very ornate, fucking heavy ass, bloody hardwood fucking office desk. The green vinyl with the studs on the top of it and everything. And as we're going, like we're pulling it out, it's fucking heavy as. I'm like, hang on, is there anything in the drawers? And I've opened this top drawer and this thing just started rolling towards me. I'm like, what's this? And he goes, that's a 38 caliber shark gun. I'm like, oh, it's a thump gun. He goes, yeah. I go, got any ammo for it? And he said, no. I said, do you still want it? And he goes, no. Can you take it off my hands? I fucking oath I can.
Free gun. Who can complain about that?
Yeah, so that's how those things usually go.
Like if one of these jobs ends up one of these job applications ends up panning out, and I have a job again, I might offer Taz some money for this 1911. I actually kind of like it now.
Hard to dislike him.
Oh yeah.
I've never bought a drink. Had several bought for me. Yeah, fucking vajayjay privilege right there in a
Exactly.
nutshell.
Must be nice being a woman.
But also, it is nice to look like a football player too, like a rugby league player, because that's another thing I constantly get in pubs. Is like, "Oh, good game, mate!" And someone slaps me on the back and chucks a drink in front of me. I'm like, oh, what? Yeah, you're so and so from such and such team, aren't you? No. Oh, well, fuck it. Anyway, have a good game, mate. Okay, thanks.
Why are you still saying no? I'd be fucking right in that one. Hell yeah, I am. You want my autograph?
Because I haven't got the first fucking clue about the person they're talking about anyways, and if they do end up asking any questions, I'm fucking screwed completely right from the get-go. I couldn't even bullshit my way out of that situation.
You know what? Would you guys be interested to know that I right now have this 1911 sitting in an old and about a 20-year-old M9 U.S. Army M9 pistol holster? Like, how am I the only guy thinking this is just so freaking cool?
The one my dad used to have, it came with a leather shoulder holster.
Oh yeah, the cross draw ones.
Mm.
I see MC left, but I'm completely nerding out about this thing.
No, it sounds awesome. But yeah, I think we will wrap it up, everybody. Thank you all for coming out. Falcon, it was a pleasure. We had told you before when we nerd out on airplanes, we would have you on. I am glad you were available.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we almost missed you.
Like I had this past week was the shittiest is the shittiest week I've ever had. But this actually kind of made everything a little better.
Well, that's good. I'm glad. Hey,
By the
you're
way,
always welcome, of course.
oh,
So
thanks.
let us know if you want to come back on and talk a little bit about the Great War as
Will there be
we
more
continue
aircraft things?
on this journey. Next week
There's
we'll
more.
go back to our normal format where we're talking about the battles. I believe we'll be in what October and November. I believe
October, November, yeah. Yeah, well,
Can
there's
I
still
make one
plenty of.
public service announcement? If you're going to, if you're in real bad, if your company's doing really bad, you're going to have to close the doors. Warn your employees before you close the doors.
Oh, but there's no fun in that.
Yeah, they claim, oh, so people don't come back and shoot us. Bitch, that's exactly what you shouldn't do. Is have us all go in there and say, oh, and tell us, oh, by the way, you're all being laid off. Oh no, they don't call it laid off; they call it furlough. Yeah, nobody believes them.
Oh, ouch. It was. I'm sorry, man. That's fucked. And
Yeah, I know. But I
we'll leave it at
appreciate the
that because
sentiment.
it's your personal life. But yeah, that's fucked. Once again, thank you everybody for coming out. And Falcon, you are always welcome. We will be back with October, November, I believe. 1915, or are we still in 1914? I think we're in 1915 at this point.
We're in 15.
Okay. So there we are. Good night. Good luck. Don't go to France. There's trenches there, and it's really muddy. Candid barely made it out alive. All right. Just don't go.
Yeah, she's
We're
not
out.
there anymore, so there's no reason to go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the only cool person left. Good night. Good luck. Sayonara. Farewell.